Now it's time for our first 30-minute capsule session. Over to you, Pilar.
So, welcome everybody to our 11 a.m. capsule. It is entitled Women of the Viking Age. It is in our general humanities sector, and it is precepted by Dr. Irina Manea. This is an August candidate. Dr. Irina Manea is a Romanian living in Germany with a flair for Nordic cultures. She has a PhD in Norse mythology from the University of Bucharest, and her main research interests comprise the history of Vikings, magic, and the supernatural in the Norse world, legendary sagas, and sagas of the Icelanders. Irina is a recurrent preceptor in the space program. So, before beginning our capsule, I just have a couple of questions related to the content of this capsule to pique your curiosity about it. So the two questions which I'm going to post also in the chat are, do you think Viking women had control over their own lives and choices? And the other question is, do you think they had opportunities outside the household and even influenced decision making? And now over to you, Irina, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Pilar. Really happy to be here to present one of the classes I am offering with Signum University. This class is about the fascinating world of women in the Viking Age. This is no longer a new area of research, pretty much has been done over the past 2 or 3 decades, but it is still something that I think has quite a discrepancy in public history compared with academic history, because there are a lot of misconceptions floating around, as well as information that is not really full or up to date. So my purpose with this class would be to give an overview over the multiple roles and significances of women in the Viking Age, and like you said, just refer to this idea of women and whether they were stuck to the household because it's something that you would expect, or if they did something a little more in the Viking Age. And referring to that, we do have quite a lot of, like I said, misconceptions, and perhaps the prevailing one is the one regarding women as warriors. So after a very long period where women were confined to this space of the household, we now are confronted with this idea of women as warriors, encouraged by this whole image of power woman from TV series, including the famous Viking series from the History Channel. Is this actually true? So if you have an opinion about this, feel free to express this in the chat. I would like to say that it is not completely unfounded. We do have a couple of references to the whole idea of the woman warrior, but we should not highlight it too much. If we look in the Byzantine sources, for example, so the Eastern Roman Empire, we have a couple of interesting references. You will find an account of the 11th century. The author's name is Ioan Skylitzes, and he has an account of a war between the Byzantines and the so-called Rus. So the Rus were some sort of Vikings in the east, but they were not really Vikings. They were more like a mixed community. They had a strong Scandinavian component, but also they were mixed up with all kinds of Slavic communities, as well as other communities living there. But anyway, when he describes this account, it's very interesting that he says, when checking the bodies of the people who died, some women in armor were found. This is not the only reference. If you look in Irish sources, you're also going to find a little bit of material. You have the source called The War of the Irish with the Foreigners, relating stuff happening in the 9th century and the 10th century, and there you would have accounts about flotillas led by a woman, the so-called Red Daughter, whose son died in Clontarf, the battle from the 11th century between Vikings and the Irish. Actually, a more complicated story, but I will leave it for later. So we do have a couple of references to women participating in combat. But I would not go as far as to say that this was an occupation which was available to all women in the Viking Age. This is rather something from contemporary perspective. We tend to, focus on that which is a little more appealing. It's entertaining to see armies of Lagerthas fighting in honor of Froya in the series Vikings because, the mundane occupations, preoccupations are not that appealing as seeing these women actually fighting. A lot of discussion was encouraged by the discovery, actually a new discovery about an older discovery, which is a burial. It is a burial from the town called Birka from Sweden, one of the most important trading towns of the Vikings. And here we do know of a burial from the burial was excavated in the 19th century. It was not really done quite properly. There were some problems with excavating the ground and the burial as well as labeling it. But at any rate, it was reevaluated in the past few years, and what was long believed to be the burial of a high-ranking Viking warrior was found to actually contain not a man but a woman. And this grave is exceptionally rich because it includes a whole set of weapons. We have a sword, an axe, a fighting knife, as well as arrows, spearheads, and shields, as well as horse riding equipment, 2 horses, and very elaborate clothing with connections to the eastern steppes. So this was quite a sensation in the press because the individual was confirmed to be a female, biologically female, so that really overturned a century of assumption. She was not only a woman, but she was also buried in male clothing, and this would change the dominant view that Viking era women were not warriors. And it suggests at least that in death, some women would have been presented as warriors. And I'm saying that because we shouldn't conclude either from this one grave that the presence of warrior women was a constant. Furthermore, the body doesn't really have signs of trauma, so no skeletal evidence of battle injuries were really found. So this means that her involvement in warfare is unclear. Yeah, sure, we can assume that she would have been a very successful warrior, perhaps. But it is also important to note that when we're discussing archaeological evidence, the dead don't bury themselves. So you have a whole community involved in burying a person. So the people dealing with the burial would have chosen these objects for this woman. So we should think about them as either objects that she would have used in her life or as symbolic markers of power or status rather than literal indicators of her role in life. But either way, if the labeling is correct, and if indeed we are dealing with a woman in a weapon burial, that is interesting because it compels us to reassess the role of women in the Viking Age. So it doesn't prove that women were acting as regular warriors, but it does prove that at least it was maybe this option. And it also proves that in the way the people saw the dead, so in the afterlife, this would have also been an option. So being buried with these items in order to show power and status. And it's something you also are going to see in later sources, in legendary sagas. Some of them are very entertaining and interesting. There is one example, the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, and here you find this very common stereotype of the shield maiden. Hervor is a shield maiden, and the Christian author doesn't really seem to have a problem with that. I mean, he's not really dismissive when describing her activities, which are rather unexpected in this very masculine society. And she has, for example, one extraordinary passage where she speaks with her father, Angantyr, who is a very famous berserker, and he died and he took the sword with him in the burial mound. And she goes to the mound and she tries to persuade her father to give her the sword because this is her rightful heirloom. So this whole literary trope of the shield maiden would have been quite common in the legendary sagas. All right. If we look closer to archaeology, we are going to find some very high status graves pertaining to women. And one of the most famous examples is the burial of Oseberg, the ship that you can visit in Oslo Museum. Now there is a new museum being built, but it's kept there, and it's going to be transported to the new location. So this is one of the richest burials in the whole Viking Age. So not only women's burial, but burial in general. And the ship is quite interesting because it doesn't really seem to have been used for practical reasons. It's quite fragile. It would have had a crew of at least 30 individuals, about 20 meters in length. So if it was indeed used in transportation or combat. However, because it looks kind of like delicate in comparison to other ships, it is quite possible that this was actually built for the sake of craftsmanship, or for the burial of an aristocrat, which is really the case here. We have two women in this burial, as well as a lot of other stuff, which we are lucky to have, as a matter of fact, because the grave was plundered a few years after it was organized. So the grave stems from the year 834. The bones were quite disorganized, and some jewelry is missing alongside precious objects, but we are able to see many other objects as well as remains, for example, from oxen, horses, dogs, and so on. And there's also a lot of food, remnants of grain and fruit, elaborate wooden chests, and these women themselves were buried in quite a luxurious manner. So one of the women was buried in a red wool dress with a twill pattern and a fine white linen veil, and the other one wore a plain blue wool dress with a wool veil. So this does suggest some kind of social difference. However, the whole idea of a woman being buried with her slave is a bit out of date right now. We're trying to reevaluate it, because it's not really certain that we are actually dealing with a slave here. At any rate, you're going to find a lot of very high quality stuff in this grave, as you can see here. A wooden cart from Oseberg, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, and the only known complete Viking Age example. Very elaborate cart, might have also been built specifically for this funeral. There are also some quite amazing tapestries in this burial. A lot of them seem to depict some sort of funeral procession. You're going to find there masked where men and women, as wolves, as boars, as bears, as well as horned figures, and the whole tapestry just gives credence to this whole idea of a funeral procession, or at least some kind of magical and religious purpose. So this is one of the examples from archaeology that you might find, pointing to this whole idea of women, or at least some women, having a great importance in a society, not necessarily as warriors, but as women taking part in some form of leadership. And speaking of leadership, if you read some of the sagas, you're going to notice that a lot of these women fall into quite a stereotypical role, which is that of the wetter, so the woman who incites men to commit acts of revenge, for example, or some other form of agency. Storytellers do have a passion for framing women as being these vengeful creatures. The cold counsel of the women is also something that is quite a stereotype in the sagas. Now, this might have some sort of historical reality underneath, in the sense that women engaging in such activities did have a form of political agency while doing so. So they weren't able to decide quite directly from themselves, but they definitely would have had some sort of influence if they were surrounded by chieftains, kings, and so on. Very interestingly, this kind of behavior, so egging on the men to engage in violent acts, is associated mostly with pagan behavior in these sources. So there's this very indicative of the way Christian authors imagined the role of women in pre-Christian times. And we have some very interesting examples. We have the saga of Olaf the Saint, where we are informed by the author Snorri Sturluson, who's this very famous chieftain and Icelandic author, probably heard of him. We're informed that the Battle of Stiklastadir, where Olaf the Saint, so one of the Christianizing kings of Norway, died, and he attributes this great failure to a bunch of women who egged on their husbands, and this led to a confrontation, and eventually the king died. So you're going to find the names of Sigríður Snorrisdóttir and Sigríður Skjalsdóttir, and they're both involved in some kind of conflict, both political and religious. For example, the first Sigrid I mentioned, her first husband by the name Olvir, was a convinced worshipper of the old religion, and she gets a second husband because her first one is killed by Olaf the Saint, and eventually Olaf the Saint kills her sons from the first marriage as well. And she tries to convince the second husband to go against Olaf the Saint. So something similar happens with the second Sigurd, that they're also related. It's a very complicated story, like saga authors like to write. At any rate, these two women are allegedly the reason why Olaf the Saint dies in this battle. And then you have the very famous example of Queen Gunhildr, the wife of Erik Bloodaxe. You find her in the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, and she is presented as this evil woman with magical abilities she learned from the Finns, from the Somi people, and she has this very prolonged conflict with Egil, and the author, allegedly Snorri as well, really does his best to point out how evil and malevolent this woman is. So when you find such references in the later sources, this is a great question mark, because it makes us wonder about the motivations of the Christian authors in presenting women as such. But like I said, to me, this is a sign that women were indeed capable of some kind of agency, but rather in the backstage. Nevertheless, this was a good opportunity to try to impose their own will. You're going to find women in other roles as well, perhaps unexpected roles. For example, you're going to find women who are great sponsors of runestones. Runestones were among the most important commemorative monuments in Scandinavia, at least in some regions of Sweden, where they prevail in the 10th and 11th century. And you have quite a lot of widows sponsoring such monuments. Actually, being a widow was quite an advantage. You had an enormous amount of power if you were a widow, and besides that, you're also going to find women sponsoring bridges. So this is something you're going to find on runestones as well. So usually a woman sponsors the erection of a monument, of a commemorative monument, and she takes advantage of this opportunity in order to say that she also built a bridge in the area. So this kind of infrastructure would have definitely been very important for the communities, and women would have had some sort of agency in this context as well. We also have one example of a rune master, so a rune carver, a woman actually carving herself, and that is Gun Borgheim. She is credited with carving a stone in the region of Helsingland. Interestingly, we also have an example of a poetess by the name Jorun Skaldmer. Skaldmer actually meaning the maiden poetess, and she wrote the so-called biting message preserved in the saga of Harold Fairhair. She's not the only example. We also have Steirun Refsdottir. She appears in the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, and she is really cool because she wrote this whole poem about how the god Thor managed to sink some ships belonging to Christian missionaries. So I think she is a very interesting character among others. One other very important role where you're going to find women in the Viking Age is that of the prophetess or the sorceress. Prophetesses seem to have a literary reality, but also a historical one. So I would say that they do have a social reality, not only regarding their ability for foresight, but also for the so-called Seidr, which involves, Seidr magic involves a lot of things. I actually have a separate course on that as well, Old Norse magic. It involves manipulating the present as well, manipulating the future in order to persuade the gods and even to go against the will of the gods in order to forge your own reality. So we do have some pretty old reference to the so-called Volur or Seithkonur, the prophetesses or sorceresses, even from the time of Tacitus. Tacitus speaks of Veleda, for example. She's a prophetess with divine attributions, and he says that she managed to predict the defeat of the Romans, and she also represented tribes in negotiations. So that means that we have a combination of this role of political power as well as magician. Well, this role, the professional status of a magician or a sorceress, this is something you're going to find in the older source, in the in the younger sources as well. If you read the Poetic Edda, of course, we have the Völuspá, the first poem from the Poetic Edda, where Odin is the one who raises a vulva from the dead in order to ask questions about the beginning and the end of the world. They are depicted in later sources as being very powerful, but sometimes also wicked and not trustworthy. So, in a sense, I think the Norse would have preserved memories of powerful women who could prophesize, and it is some sort of social expectation that they would confirm something to happen in society. So, for example, you're going to find Volur being asked by chieftains to prophesize about the end of a famine. This is something you find in the saga of Eric the Red, where we actually have the longest description of such a ritual performed by the Volva, the sorceress Thorbjörg Little Volva. She attends the feast, and you have this whole description about how a platform is raised for her and how she has to find some people to chant some spells with. So it's a very lengthy description. Many elements would have definitely been the imagination of the author, but I think it is a sign, at least, of some sort of memory preserved in later sources about women who actually wielded this amount of power. In the legendary sagas, there is something we can notice. These are later sources, like from the 14th, 15th century. We notice that actually men start usurping this role. We do have men magicians in the family sagas as well. So the more historical one, the more realistic ones, so to speak. But generally speaking, women seem to have dominated this area from the beginning, and then men started to usurp this domain. So these are a couple of the roles we find if we look at high status women, at least. And an interesting question, I think, perhaps even more interesting, is what common women were doing. You know, like women in everyday life, because they were also very important, and I think they're not really talked about enough. We have to think of the Viking Age as being an age where farmers would have been the most important. So yes, of course, we speak a lot about raiders, traders, the Viking social identity, and so on. But most of these people would have been farmers, and to keep a household together, you really needed the help of women. So women really needed to be present in farms. If not a wife, then at least some sort of housekeeper. And we do have references to women taking over farms, managing them. The housekeeper would have had quite a chief position. This is confirmed archaeologically by the presence of keys in a lot of women's graves. And as a general rule, women had to take care of the affairs within the house, and the masculine domain seemed to have been outside. So if you're wondering what they were doing, well, they were doing quite a lot of things. They would have been involved in processing and converting raw products. Dairy operations, making milk and cheese, would have been something extremely important here. Housewives would accompany shepherds, while men attended the assemblies, the things. And by the 15th century, this profession, this occupation would have also been professionalized. So there was an expectation, as we find in the later law codes, that a woman should be able to milk 80 ewes per day, and you did have huts in order to do so, and so on. So definitely a very important operation here, the dairy operation, and then you have references to all kinds of other activities from laundry and body services to the preparation of food, grinding on millstones, for example. We even have a myth about it, the myth of the magic mill. So all kinds of more or less historical references to the importance of these more mundane tasks. Well, we call them mundane, but to them, they would have definitely been very important. And speaking of important activities for the household, I would like to end with the role of the textile worker. The textile worker in the Viking Age would have been absolutely essential. We even have, at least in the case of Iceland, the vadmol, the homespun cloth, which would have been used as a form of currency. So you can imagine the importance of this whole chain of production. So women were the ones involved in this activity, and wool production also required cooperation, and this cooperation occurred mainly among female workers. They would have worked in a sort of a subterranean hut called the dingja, which was very dark and humid, was kind of like a terrible environment to work in. But it also gave rise to myths as well. So the myth of the fates. Spinning and weaving your destiny might have also had something to do with this very concrete activity of working in the dark and shaping something, in this case, shaping the future. And it's a very powerful metaphor of the importance of spinning and weaving as occupations that were essential in the Viking Age, not only for cloth and for selling cloth, but also for creating the sails of the ships of the Viking Age. So you can imagine the fundamental role women played in this part and in this age. So if you're going to join the class, we're going to be discussing about all these aspects. The first lecture involves the daily life of women. We'll be discussing about marriage, children, and work. The second lecture will be about this position of high power, so queens, warriors, and avengers. The third lecture about sorceresses and prophetesses, and the fourth lecture about divine images of women. For example, we'll be discussing some goddesses and, of course, the Valkyries, and what they can tell us about Viking Age society and how women were perceived in Viking Age society, as well as later on in medieval Iceland, especially because that's where most of our sources come from, but also more generally speaking, medieval Scandinavia. So I hope you join. I also have a bunch of other classes on Old Norse religion and magic, as well as a series about Vikings in general.
Thank you, Irina. This was great. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. And yes, as Jen Gosling posted in the chat, you can explore Irina's profile and modules, and you can always wishlist her classes. Remember that this particular module is an August candidate, and I guess you answered the questions that we posted at the beginning. And of course, women were really important in Viking society. So thank you so much for your presentation.